So here I am again. This is getting slightly less weird. I'm sitting here talking to my computer, so I hope it's still working for you guys. Just a quick reminder, I don't know how many of you got to those all of those events, archaeological events over the last couple of days, but don't forget about the one tonight. This is on tonight, Friday at 4 p.m. At Hale Science 270, right where you are now. Dr. John Hawks is going to talk about Neanderthal genomes, and you will have the chance both to meet him and to snack a little bit afterwards. There's a reception, so go to that if you've got some time. It should be pretty cool. But we need to wrap up the lecture from Wednesday and then move on to some new stuff. And once again, we were looking at the Natufian site of Abu Huraira to sort of illustrate what happens during the later parts of the Neolithic. So the Abu Huraira site's founded before the Younger Dryas starts, during this period of time when it's really, really in a good place if you're harvesting wild grasses, and these folks were clearly harvesting a lot of wild grasses. But as the Younger Dryas hits, the abundance of wild grass around the site had to have dropped pretty precipitously and stayed low for quite some time. So it shifts from being a really good place to live to not being such a great place to live. Now it's in the Euphrates River Valley. It's up near the headwaters of the Euphrates River Valley. So it's not that there's no water around. There is, but it changes the wild habitat. So the access of these folks to their staple wild crops really dropped, and we can see that in the environmental indicators. And these are hunters and gatherers, right? These are not farmers, although we will be seeing farmers there later. So what happens to the plants that they use? And what we see over time is an increased emphasis on these dry adapted species. Now what you're looking at are the Natufian divided into sort of three parts. So phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 is the earliest. You see at the bottom about 11,200 BC. Phase 3 the latest, pushing towards 10,500 BC when the site is abandoned for a while. And what you see is at the top of that is woodland species basically disappear entirely. There's no more hackberries, there's no more pears, there's no more cherries, those kinds of things. Lentils, legumes and lentils in particular, which require a fair amount of moisture to live, are quite abundant at the beginning, and then they drop off, and then they come back at the end. Come back again at the end, and we'll talk about that. Large-seeded grasses, right? I said that the trend from Ohalo to Natufian sites is that large-seeded grasses increase in frequency and small-seeded grasses decrease. And what you see here is that the large-seeded grasses fall off, wheat and rye in particular. Those are plants that need water, and they're replaced in that phase 2 by small-seeded grasses. And small-seeded grasses are these more dryland species. So they're actually shifting back over time there, away from what they've been doing for centuries, presumably because the abundance of these large-seeded grasses are disappearing. And chenopods are similar to these small-seeded grasses. Very tiny little seeds, very dryland adapted kinds of plants. Lentils, I said, reappear in phase 3, which is weird. And that wheat and rye decline is interesting because they never go to zero. They never go to zero. And today at Abu Huraira, you cannot grow plants. You cannot grow these plants. You need to help them along. The domesticated and the wild versions don't survive there without human help. And we know that the Younger Dryas was drier than at present. And we know that lentils don't grow around Abu Huraira on their own these days, and the Younger Dryas was drier than at present. So what's going on? How did these plants get to a site when they can't get there naturally? And remember, we're talking about these wild plants. What we see at the same time are field weeds. Now, these are not sort of dryland weedy things that just grow. These are the kinds of weeds that grow in open fields. They need prepared open areas, and they need adequate moisture. So at the same time that we're seeing a stabilized, a sort of an evening off in reliance on large seeded grasses that need more moisture than would have been naturally available, and the same time that we're seeing lentils that need more moisture than would be naturally available, we're also seeing these field weeds coming in. And the explanation seems to be that what these folks are doing is cultivating. And it's really important to distinguish between cultivation and domestication. They're growing and tending these crops in prepared fields, probably fairly sheltered areas near springs down towards the Euphrates River, perhaps. So they're concentrating moisture. There's no irrigation. There's no traces of irrigation. But somehow they're helping these plants along. And we know hunter-gatherers do this in recent times. This is well documented in parts of California and other places. That's quite distinct from domestication. quite distinct. Domestication means controlling the reproduction of plants and animals and making the individual organs better for us rather than better for them. Everything in the Natufian levels at Abu Huraira is wild. But there's no way that those plants could have been there late in it, in the middle of the Younger Dryas, unless there was cultivation without domestication. We're not seeing tons of storage facilities, but we are seeing some. So like the one that you can see in this photograph down at the bottom. And I showed you this picture before. This is going back for a second to Ain Malaha. And what you see throughout the Natufian area during the Younger Dryas is increasingly sort of insubstantial houses. Those big houses go away, and you find people that look like they're staying in place less, so they're moving around more as the environment deteriorates. And yet we still see these storage pits, right? They're not enormous, but they're still relying on these crops. But the major part of the occupation leaves places like Abu Huraira, and Abu Huraira was abandoned at 10,500. There's a big sterile zone until the upper levels of the site, which we'll talk about later. And we see Natufian people concentrated down along the coast. And so they're more mobile, they're hanging on to this similar way of life, but it's not quite the same. So, end of the Ice Age, we've got these huge environmental changes, plant and animal communities are majorly reorganizing, people are intensifying resource procurement, getting more out of a limited area. Specifically talking about Natufians, they're intensifying. We see this broad spectrum hunting and gathering lots of different plants and animals. Especially early on, we get big sites, a couple of hundred people, and fairly long duration, settled villages. We see reconstruction of houses at sites like Ain Malaha, on the same footprint as the previous house. As we get later, we get massive environmental change in the Younger Dryas. Seriously impacts resources. Sites become smaller and less permanent overall. We see this people juggling their resources they're dependent on, and they're controlling and manipulating these staple wild plant species. So what happens next? Younger Dryas ends around 10,000, 9,600 in that ballpark, and things revert to much better conditions, much more like the previous conditions. And we'll focus on plants for a minute. We've said at Ohelo, there's a high percentage of small grain plants, small grain grasses in the diet, and that drops into the Natufian, and it drops even more into the Neolithic. We give the new term, this new Stone Age. Neolithic refers to this period of time when we're beginning to see the appearance of something that's going to look like farming in a little while. What we'll see is that it's a little hard to tell exactly when it starts. But there's a shift away from those small grain grasses again to a major focus on the larger grain grasses, wheat, barley, and rye. And that focus actually increases as we go closer and closer to the present. So what's the difference between cultivation and domestication? The big thing is control of reproduction. And the two big things are control of reproduction and increasing the productivity of the plant. So in wild wheat and barley, we have smaller seeds. I talked about the rachis, that point of attachment of the plant. It's brittle in wild plants. They want the seeds to fall off. And they have these large and sharp awns. That's those little antler-like things at the end of the spikelet. And those are large and sharp because they stick into the wool of passing sheep and goats and things like that. And it helps to move the seeds around. So it's really good for the plant. It's not so good for people. What people want is more food out of the plant. So we select for larger seeds, fatter seeds with more nutrition in them than the seed actually needs to germinate. We like sturdy rachises that keeps the seed attached to the plant. Right? We don't want the plant to fall off, the seeds to fall off on the ground. We want them on the plant when we go to harvest. And we want small awns because they're of no use to us at all. Now let's go back to harvesting technology. There's two ways to get seeds off of a plant. We talked about sickles, and they're really common in Natufian sites, and they remain really common in the Near East. They're common in the world today. To use a sickle, what you do is you grab a handful. Remember that picture of that wild wheat field. You grab a handful of the stalks of those wheat, and you cut the stalks of those wheat, and you drop it into whatever container you're using to take that stuff back to wherever you're living. And when you hit the head of that, when you hit the stalk of that plant, it shakes the head. So if not everything, if you're harvesting the stuff sometime around when it's ripe, and if it's a little bit farther along and it's got a brittle rachis, that stuff's going to fall off when you hit it. So you're systematically selecting for seeds with a sturdy rachis, a sturdy, durable attachment to the plant. The other way you can harvest seeds is the way people in the Great Basin in the western United States harvest them, using seed beaters. So what these women were doing in Nevada and Utah in the pictures on the right is taking a beater like that one on the bottom, holding the pan, a large open basket that they've got under the plants, and hitting the head of the plant so that the seeds with the brittle ratchets fall off and fall into their collecting devices, into their collecting baskets. It's the opposite of what people in Natufian did, and it works just fine. You come in a little bit later, so when the stuff is ready to fall off on its own, and you just help it along. Notice the difference in the effect on what you take home, though, because these women are taking home the stuff with the brittle ratchets. The people who are using sickles in the Near East are taking home brittle ratchet stuff that hasn't fallen off yet, and also they're systematically selecting for that sturdy ratchets. So let's mention this site. We're going to get into a lot of sites today, and I don't want you to panic about memorizing them all. We'll tell you which ones you need to know. So Ramat Harif is a Natufian site in Israel. It's about 11,000 years old. It's got these stone foundation circular sites right on the cusp of the Younger Dryas, so they're still building a little bit more substantial houses. And if you look at Nahal Oren, also in Israel, 2,000 years later, after the Younger Dryas, you get the same kinds of sort of houses, these stone foundation circular house floors. They're built on those terraces. You can see they're set on those. There's a wall that's holding that terrace in. So there's a community level of structure there. But there's another difference between these two sites, and that's the sturdy ratchets percentage. At Ramat Harif, there's this tiny, tiny number of sturdy ratchets in the seeds that have been collected, and it corresponds to the natural mutation rate. These are seeds that normally wouldn't have germinated, most likely, in nature, and so they don't reproduce. But you get these mutations with sturdy ratchets that keeps that characteristic in the population. At Nahal Oren, the percentage goes to 3%. Now that sounds pretty trivial, but what you're looking at is a 23,000% increase. This is not domestication, right? But it's one of the domestication traits, which means that the process of changing these plants so that they're good for us and not necessarily good for the plant itself is on the way by the time we see Nahal Oren in this early Neolithic period. But the reliance on domesticated individual plants is just barely beginning. So remember, cultivation and domestication are not the same thing. These folks are certainly cultivating. They certainly were in the Natufian. It's hard to believe they weren't doing the same thing later on. But it's really, there's really a trivial, in a numerical sense, reliance on it. We're going to talk about three periods in the Neolithic. We'll start with the early period from about 9600 to 8800. We'll call that early Neolithic or early pre-ceramic Neolithic. Then there's a middle Neolithic and a late Neolithic. We really like these creative tripartite divisions of time. Seems like the whole world is divided in threes for archaeologists, but it works out here. So we'll talk about the early first, and we'll get into the middle today, and we'll save the late Neolithic, the ceramic Neolithic, for later. This is what happens to a dependence on farming. For the early Neolithic, it's never more than 10%. It's usually much less, and people debate about whether they're really looking at domestication, right? So this is not full domestication. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of the seeds. By the middle Neolithic, definite domestication, very substantial part of the diet. By the late Neolithic, it dominates, and we'll see parallel increases in animal domestication. That is, domestication, you can alter these plants and animals very quickly, but people seem not to have done that. They seem to have shifted their reliance from wild to domesticated plants and animals over fairly long periods of time, hundreds and hundreds of years. So let's look at the early Neolithic for a little while. We'll talk about a number of these sites. So we'll look at Göbekli Tepe up in the Anatolian Plateau in Turkey. In the north, we'll look all the way down to the creatively named WF16 in Jordan, and we'll look at a couple of sites in between. So early Neolithic residential construction looks a whole lot like Natufian residential construction. This is Nahal Oren, right? Again, just to remind you about that site. These circular houses, and we'll see them kind of all over. But you begin to see these organized community construction efforts, and sometimes they're quite utilitarian. We'll see a variety of these things. This is this terrace construction. Those are artificially leveled areas that the houses are built on with retaining walls. So that takes some time and effort and some help. Right? So we're looking at communities that are pulling together for each other, in a sense. And we'll see that all over. Here's a series of those houses. Don't worry about the names of these sites. We'll look at Jericho in a minute. But just the point, my point is just that these things, they're slightly amorphous, a little bit amoeba shaped. Sometimes they're more circular, sometimes they're more oval, but they're all kind of the same in their size, maybe 4 or 5 meters across, not huge. And these are houses that you can't like add on to. It's hard to add onto a circle. You can add onto rectangles and squares, but they're you don't subdivide them very well. So they're not things that you can remodel very effectively. People lived in them and then rebuilt them, and sometimes they stayed in place for a long time. Sometimes they didn't. We'll see some variation in that. Dara shows us another aspect of construction, public construction at these sites. Dara is in Jordan, on the western edge of Jordan, in the Jordan River Valley. They're somewhat more elaborate houses there, so you get this stone foundation house with a bench. But what's particularly visible there is grain storage. What you're looking at in the upper left picture is the archaeology of one of these granaries, and they're apparently built these raised footings for the floor so that air can circulate underneath, which helps to preserve the grain over time. These are out in public. They're huge, 3 meters across, and it looks like community storage. There's not storage within a particular residential unit. It's not within the house storage. It's out in the middle of town, as though everybody's putting their harvest together. And when they look into these things at Dara, not at every site, but at Dara, they're storing wild grasses in huge quantities. Right? There's a quarter of a million out of one of these things that happen to catch fire. So visualize these things packed with grain, virtually all of it, or virtually all of it, in wild form. So they're not extensively relying on domesticates again. Presumably there are high percentages of sturdy ratchses and things like that, but they're not. This is not domesticated plants, and yet we've got settled communities with these large storage facilities, presumably communally built. The most famous communally built structure in the early Neolithic Near East is at Jericho, or Tel es-Sultan in the Palestinian territories, where you have a wall and a tower, and we'll glance at that. But Jericho is the other name for Tel es-Sultan, was founded about 11,000 years ago as an early Neolithic community, not a Natufian community, and it is a modern town today. It gets into the news usually for sad reasons. In the it's in the news most years. It contains those circular houses. There's a photograph of one on the left, and then it contains the stone tower, which would have been about 8 or 9 meters, 20 or 30 feet high. When it was built, there's a staircase that goes up through the center of it, and you can see looking up through the staircase. It's not clear whether this was defensive, whether it was there to control floods. That if you look on the reconstruction, the artist reconstruction, there's actually a rock-cut moat outside it that might have served to divert floods or something like that. It's not clear. Warfare is not an obvious characteristic of this time or place. But it takes some engineering skill to put that up and not have it fall down, and it takes some collective effort. At WF16 in Jordan, that is just the best site name ever, you find buildings like the ones at Dara, these granaries with footings for suspended floors, but at the same time, you find this very large communal structure, maybe residential structure, and you can see those guys kind of standing near the walls of it. It's got this raised bench around it, and that was quite a big building when it was up. It's not clear if it's a community center, if it's a house for lots and lots of people, if it's a ritual structure, we don't know. But clearly it's not something that is meant for a few people. It's meant to have a lot of people in it doing something. So we're beginning to see these structures that tell us about public integration and public effort, collective work, which means they have to be organized by people. There has to be a division of labor. There have to be architects so that these things don't fall down. There have to be builders, people digging holes and carrying wood. All right, so we're beginning to see some kind of organization within these communities that's been harder to see before. We can see the same kind of thing at Jerf al-Amar, which spans a number of hundred years, and we see shifts from granaries to public structures that look kind of like a kiva, so granary on the left, some kind of later public structure with a raised bench around the edge in the upper right that had the storage structure had this headless body sprawled on the floor. It's not clear if it's a murder or a ritual sacrifice. The skull that presumably goes with it was in a post hole someplace else. So you can see these residential structures outside, community structures kind of in the center again. These particular structures are square rather than circular. You can see that in the left-hand picture. But this long occupation, so complex use and reuse of these structures with ceremonial and public kinds of facilities again. The most spectacular of these, I mean, Jericho's been known the longest and it's the best known, but far and away the most spectacular is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where we find these huge semi-subterranean sort of pit structures lined with stone, with stone walls and benches, plastered floors in some cases, and these huge standing pillars. You can see an unfinished one in the quarry nearby on the lower right. And there are quite a few of these things, and these pillars are decorated, always with wild animals, some of them dangerous, like that lion or jaguar or something on the top, other times a wild boar on the lower right, other times there's ducks and there's swans and things like that. And these structures cluster on a hillside, on the top of this hill. No one has found houses, anything that looks like obvious residential structure, but the fact is that the site in and around these things is packed with residential debris. So we know people were living up there. There's stone tools and there's charcoal and there's lots of animal bone. So these are large, sort of some kind of community, maybe ceremonial center, maybe they're residential structures that were used for ceremonies, or people just liked fancy houses. But what they would do is build these great pillars, fill the damn thing up, and then go make another. And they've done remote sensing around there, and you can see in that sort of reconstructed one on the right, there's quite a few of these things clustered on the hill slope. So there's this pattern of building and rebuilding. Obviously the same kind of cooperative labor, but in forming these what are the sort of fairly spectacular structures. So these early Neolithic communities were barely relying on domesticated plants, and people actually argue about whether, especially in some of the earlier ones, they had domesticated plants at all. These were almost pure hunters and gatherers, but they lived in this incredibly productive environment with lots of plants, these relying heavily on these probably cultivation of these wild species that are beginning to exert some control over the plants. Lots and lots of different animals in them. Very large settlements in some cases, quite permanent settlements, relying heavily on grain storage. And we're seeing this kind of community integration, maybe in the case of a place like Göbekli Tepe, multi-communities integrating for these things. So it's not just the people who may have lived locally there, but people in outlying areas coming in and contributing to these. So we can see integration of communities across this Fertile Crescent landscape, sharing kind of similar sorts of efforts, similar kinds of houses, similar sorts of resources, and just barely beginning to be farmers. And as we get into the Middle Neolithic, that just changes. The Middle Neolithic diet changes. We've got no question about domestication and dramatic increase in its importance. We haven't talked about animals, but we'll see domesticated sheep and goats at this time too, with a parallel reduction in the emphasis on wild animals. So as we move from the early Neolithic to Middle Neolithic, we move from kind of farmers with fairly spectacular archaeology, including some fairly spectacular public structures, to people who really were farmers. They still harvested the wild world. They still hunted and gathered, but they were really farmers. And life changes. This is a photograph of Abu Huraira, and you can see Abu Huraira right there. There's a nice flat surface, and that mound with those sort of temporary buildings on it is the site. The Natufian level is right at the ground level that you see. It's at the base of that mound. And the mound above, every cubic centimeter of deposit in that mound above is archaeology. And it looks like this when you dig into it. It is floor after floor and wall after wall. All of this construction is mud brick construction. So you build these sites, you build these houses, eventually they start to deteriorate, they break down, the mud collapses, you rebuild on the top, and slowly the site just rises up off the surface, and you get what's called a tell site, T-E-L-L, which is this huge mound. All of these houses shift over from those round Natufian and early Neolithic houses to these freestanding rectangular kinds of houses, often with rooms inside. These are houses that you can remodel and expand if the family gets bigger. So they'll have kitchen areas inside, and they'll have burials under the floors, and alleyways and walkways between the houses. They probably looked something like this. In the later periods, you'll see there's sheep and goats over there. We'll actually see cattle and pigs later on, but not during the Middle Neolithic. And the community was huge. the Tel site, the town that is today the site of Abu Huraira, was probably 4,000 to 6,000 people. These are immense communities, and compared to what we've seen before, and they're immense communities that require some kind of social integration. We don't see this very clearly, but this really is a different way to live. They're farmers. They're raising rye and barley and wheat. I typed white, but that's the wheat. That's the daily typo. Lentils and chickpeas. And the town probably looked something like this. Right? This is a modern version of this, also in Syria. Abu Huraira, again, remember, is in Syria in the Euphrates River Valley. Many of the species in the diet are the same as the ones that were there in the Natufian levels, but they've shifted their emphasis. So that upper one is the Natufian diet, the lower one is the Middle Neolithic diet. So you get grains from wild grasses, 30 species of wild grasses, shifts to just 5 species of cultivated cereal grasses that make up about 2/3 of the total diet, or 2/3 of the total seeds. Wild legumes that were 21 species turn into cultivated legumes that are just 3 or 4 species, and the wild species fall off. So you can see this immense narrowing of the diet from that broad spectrum, and a huge increase, particularly substantial here, more than you see at some other sites, in their reliance on domesticated plants. In the early Neolithic, we see, there's no error. That's another typo, I apologize. Gazelle, not at Abu Huraira because there is no early Neolithic there, but gazelle becomes important, but as we see middle and later Neolithic animals at Abu Huraira, we see sheep and goats to start, pigs and cattle later. And these spread out, they're domesticated in different areas, and they spread out all through the Fertile Crescent. When you look at this, if you download this and look at it off of D2L, remember those dates are not calibrated, they're uncalibrated years, they're not calendar years. So seeds, cereals and other seeds are a staple in the diet, and if you remember how they processed them in Natufian times, they processed them the same way during Neolithic times at Abu Huraira on those grinding stones. So let's talk about burials. People were buried underneath the floors of houses. That is, the ancestors lived with you. Your grandparents, perhaps your parents, would be right under the floor of the house. And there are lots of burials at Abu Huraira. And there's lots of Neolithic burials, although there's more of them. I'm sorry, lots of Natufian burials, although there are more from the Neolithic. Bones tell us our lives. Bones tell us bone chemistry. They tell us our habitual activities. And if you're going to make a living with with seeds as the staple of your diet, you're going to be doing a lot of grinding, and that affects your body. It affects the characteristic posture that you use these things on, and some of you have done this when you were little kids, maybe not so little kids, right? The characteristic posture has effects on your vertebral column, it has effects on your knees, and it has effects on your toes. And we're going to talk about toes here. Your toes are meant to point out straight, and there's an articulation on the toe. You can see the articular surface of the toe, and on most of our toes, those articular surfaces are at the end of the bone. When you are grinding for hours and hours a day, and you start this activity around age 8, that articular surface, and you can see this really clearly in that lower right, actually moves around the edge of the toe. That's not the way that person's toes were when they were born. The articulation was at the end. But because of this characteristic activity, the articulation is actually shifted around to so that woman, and this is all about women, was comfortable with her toes flexed like that. It gives you a little more power when you're pushing on that grinding stone. But they're doing this work so much and so continuously on such a daily basis that it is changing the bones in their bodies. And it is only on women, and it is on virtually all women, and it is not different from what you see in the Natufian period. We, of course, don't do that, except maybe sometimes when we do that to modern women. My daughter wears shoes like this. I have no idea what her toe bones look like, but it is the same distortion of the toe, just so you know in case you hadn't noticed that. Okay. So there's not much change in women's work, actually, from being a hunter-gatherer to being a Middle Neolithic farmer. And Natufian women did a lot of the same work that these Middle Neolithic women did at that same site at Abu Huraira. So what happens over time? There's no better measure of the biological success of a community than the condition of children. And what we see at Abu Huraira is that as you look over time, if you divide the site into 3 periods, 2A, 2B, and 2C, the percentage of babies, of neonates and infants in the death assemblage, that is, in those burials that are coming out under the floors of those houses, goes up. So that during the earlier parts, the beginning of this community, the neonates comprise, if you look on that curve on the right, neonates comprise maybe 4 or 5% of the total population. By the end, they're 40%. That speaks to huge losses of children and a biologically dysfunctional community. What causes this? Right? We know that people are working really hard. That's just part of the deal. But somehow over time, this community is failing in the most fundamental way that a human community can fail. And eventually the site is completely abandoned. And it is still abandoned today. That is, people do not live in the vicinity of Abu Huraira. They graze sheep and goats in the area. People move through using the area, but it is not a permanent place, and it has not been a permanent place for people to live since the Neolithic. Not too far away there are permanent places, but not the vicinity of the site. Almost certainly, this is the result of human impacts, anthropogenic impacts on the environment around there, because people are using those fields over a long time. That increases erosion. They deforest the area for construction, for firewood. There may be some climatic effects. But we can see Neolithic occupation shifting back and forth. Even successful kind of communities that are in place for a while are shifting back and forth over time, and sometimes are abandoning. And they are affecting the environment and around them in ways that are not always helpful to those communities, and that in some cases may come right down to the present. That pattern at Abu Huraira is very local. It is at the site. But if we step back from Abu Huraira and look at the Levant in general, what we can see is if we go back to the beginning of the Younger Dryas and come down well into the Neolithic, 7000 BC, we see shifts in health that are generally not in a healthier direction. So we have an enamel hypoplasia. So I'll have a picture of that in a minute. These are growth arrest lines in the teeth that come when children and infants are stressed during childhood. They become more frequent over time. They drop off at about 8,000. That reflects, and we'll see this again in another characteristic, that reflects access to cattle and pigs in the diet, and then they take off again. Dental attrition. Teeth are just wearing down more as they're eating more and more seeds, because as you grind these seeds, you get more grit in the diet. Antemortem tooth loss goes up. That is loss of teeth before you die. That goes up as teeth wear down more. They fall out of your mouth. Cavities go up over time. This is what I mean by hypoplasias. You can see those lines in the teeth. There's a dental carie or cavity bigger than I want to have in my teeth, I'll tell you that. And you can see the degree of tooth wear that increases from the Natufian on the left to the Neolithic on the right. You can see the dentin on the inside of those teeth being exposed. Stature goes down. Until they get domesticated animals. Again, there's that spike a little bit earlier. Getting more protein helps stature, and then it falls off again. Periosteal infections on the bone go up. Periosteal infections are just infections to that sheath of the bone, the one we talked about in the case of ER 1808, that Homo erectus specimen, where the periosteum was getting ripped off the bone by muscle movements. That's not what this is. These are just infections, infectious disease, possibly from being around animals, possibly just from being around lots of people. Remember, we haven't talked about sewage disposal because there isn't any evidence of systematic community sewage disposal. So people are exposed to germs and things like that just by virtue of living in towns of hundreds and thousands at a time. There's direct evidence, we'll glance at this later, for tuberculosis and malaria, where that's preserved in sort of wet, and malaria occurs in wet areas. And there's some evidence of encephalitis after 9000 BC. Right? So these are changing the conditions of life, and they're not changing it always in good ways. So how do we look at food production? Remember, the foods that they're eating are the foods that we still eat today. Right? I mean, these are the roots of our diet. And this is the biggest change, it's the biggest change we've ever seen between the way humans interact with the environment. In the way humans interact with the environment. And it's probably one of the two biggest changes in humans' history, the other one being changes in the way we deal with each other, which we'll talk about later. So we see Younger Dryas climatic stress, right? Natufians turn to cultivation. So we can see a kind of a mechanical or a material push towards manipulating plants. And then we see this historical accidents. Instead of using seed beaters, these folks are using sickles, and that pushes plants on the way to domestication. Rising population as we come out of the Younger Dryas. These larger communities, more permanent communities need more resources. You have to intensify, and domestication is a great way of intensifying, right? Increasing local yields. So we've got a series of accidents and this series of general processes of change operating together over the course of a couple of thousand years. And they're creating both long-term problems as well as solutions. And we will talk about more of this. We'll pick this up again on Monday and look at some other changes in the Middle Neolithic, and over the course of the week we will then carry on into the later Neolithic. I hope you guys go to the lecture this afternoon, and I hope you have a great weekend, and I will be back in person on Monday.